All right, so you might have heard of a technique called focus stacking, and it's one of those things where you're like, yeah, I should probably know what that is. I got you covered in this video. Let's talk about focus stacking. Hey everyone, Brian Matias here. Welcome to the Great Outdoors. Focus stacking is an important technique to have in your tool belt, especially if you're a landscape photographer and you want to get full depth. You want from the foreground to the middle ground to the background of your photo to be in focus. Now, depending on your focal length and what your primary subjects are, where they fall in your frame, you might not even need focus stacking. It's one of those things where, see this frame right here, I'm standing here. Let's say I wanted to take a photo of myself, and I'm using right now an 85mm lens. I want myself in focus, and I want these trees to be in focus as well. As you can see right now, even if I were to take this at, say, an f11 or an f13 aperture, I'd be in focus, but those trees behind me would most likely be soft. And if I was using a wider lens, for example, maybe a 16mm lens, that wouldn't be as much of an issue because my plane of focus is much wider. And so to mitigate that, you focus stack. And it's really exactly what it sounds like. Focus stacking is where you take a series of photos and you bracket them. But unlike, say, HDR bracketing, where each photo changes your exposure settings, so you'd have like a 0, a -2, and a +2, with focus stacking, you're bracketing your focal points so that you have a photo with the foreground in focus, another one with the middle ground in focus, and maybe something in the background. And that's actually another important point. There are no hard and fast rules of how many different brackets you need to take. Part of it has to do with your focal length, part of it has to do with the aperture that you're using, and the final part is, again, where those elements fall. If you've got something really close in your foreground and you're using, say, a longer focal length, then you will need to take a few different points of focus with those brackets. And like bracketing for HDR, there are a few things that you really want to keep in mind. First and foremost, you definitely want to have your camera on a sturdy tripod. You do not want that camera moving at all. And second, you want to make sure that you have your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO locked in. So keep your camera in manual focus. You don't want to be adjusting any of those values. And finally, you want to make sure that your composition is kind of clean. In my experience, when I've tried to do focus stacking where my scene was very busy with a bunch of different branches and tree limbs and stuff, it's very, very difficult to get a good focus stack because Photoshop, which is the application we're going to use to actually combine these photos, it's going to have a hard time determining from layer to layer what elements should be sharp and what should be masked out. So again, you want to just keep that clean. And so now what I want to do is turn the camera around. I'm going to show you a basic example of where focus stacking will help. And again, it's not like a super exciting photo, but I think it will illustrate the point very, very well. And again, we're using a Sony a7R Mark IV and the Zeiss Bodice 85mm 1.8 lens. So it's a longer focal length. Your plane of focus is going to be narrower even at smaller apertures like f11 or f13. That's why focus stacking will help big time here. All right, so this is the scene that I'm going to use to illustrate the importance of focus stacking and how it could be beneficial. There's one important point that I want to make, and that is you also have to be able to control your point of focus. And so I did a video not too long ago on how to use back button autofocusing. Be sure to check that out. I think it's one of the most important custom settings that you can do, especially if you're a landscape shooter. So let me show you what I mean by that. Right now the camera is set to shoot in wide, which is the default setting. And so if I activate autofocus, all right, well, you know, the camera's going to go over there. And if that's all you're doing, you're never going to be able to change your point of focus, which is why it's important to have it on a different mode. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and select flexible spot medium, and I'm going to position it on our first point of focus. This is going to be a 3-image bracket. Remember, this camera is locked down on a tripod. It's not moving anywhere, and I'm in manual mode. So my exposure set at f11, ISO 320, 1 second. And here's another quick pro tip. Again, if you're doing landscape photography, you need a polarizer, especially if you're shooting water. Check this out. I'm going to turn off the polarizer. So look at that. I mean, no polarizer. This image is just terrible. All that surface reflection ruins the shot. And so by activating, there we go. We have a nice shot. So that's just a quick pro tip, but let's get going. So again, to recap, the camera's locked down, manual exposure, I'm set in, and I'm going to start with my foreground shot. So what I'm gonna do is I put the reticle here, my autofocus reticle, and I'm gonna engage autofocus. Now I've got a 2-second delay, so let me press the shutter button. 1, 2, photo gets taken. Now, let's preview that photo. All right, so nice photo. And here's where, without focus stacking, the photo can fall apart. Because remember, we are at 85 millimeters at f11. Let's zoom in. It'll zoom in onto the focal point, and this looks great, right? Nice, sharp photo. But watch what happens when we go a little bit further up. Ah, that branch is now out of focus, and that rock is out of focus. I want the whole photo from the first branch to that branch right behind it to the rock to be in focus. Now, I'm standing here in real life. The distance from these two branches is maybe 1.5 feet. And then the distance from that second branch to the rock is maybe 3.5 feet. It's not like it's that far apart, but because we're using a longer focal length to get that compression, your plane of focus is much, much narrower. And again, this is where focus stacking is so important. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to move this reticle and I'm going to put it right there, and we're going to take another shot. I just engaged autofocus, shutter button, 1, 2, got the shot. Now let's preview that photo. Let's zoom in. And you can see, okay, that's looking good, nice. I'll zoom out just a little bit. But watch what happens if we go to the foreground. Now this branch is soft, not quite critical focus. Same thing with that rock. That rock is also not in focus. All right, so let's go ahead and we'll take our third and final shot. I'm going to put it up here on the rock. Focus. Press the shutter button. And let's go ahead and preview that. And so we can see that rock is nice and crisp. Looks really nice. But look at that. I mean, this is out of focus and that's out of focus. So you can imagine if you were to just take one single photo without really knowing, even if you were to focus on the middle ground, you know, how many times have you heard photographers talk about just focus on the middle ground and you'll be good? Depending on your focal length and the placement of your subjects related to each other, the distance between them in the foreground, middle ground, and background, that might not cut it. Okay, we now have our focus bracketed photos. It's time to go home, import them, and I'm going to show you how to do a super easy focus stack using Adobe Photoshop. All right, I made it back home and I imported the photos from that focus stack shoot into Lightroom Classic. I'm going to take a minute and show you what I do to prepare photos before I do a focus stack. We'll send them to Photoshop, and then we're going to use Photoshop's kind of auto method to get the focus stack. But then I'm going to show you how to fix that, because shocker, it doesn't always work when you use Photoshop's auto method. Sometimes actually it can ruin the image. So we're going to look at that as well. But before we do, since we're talking about all things water, I want to take a second to tell you about the virtual waterfall photography workshop that I created. It's a ton of fun. If you are at all interested in improving your waterfall photography, check it out. I'm going to leave a link in the description below. I designed it so it doesn't take too much time, but it's going to equip you with the information you need, not just how to edit a waterfall photo, because that's taking steps ahead. You really have to understand what makes a strong waterfall photo, what's the ideal gear to use and how to use that gear, what makes a strong composition, and then, yeah, we'll go into some editing examples as well. Like I said, it's a lot of fun. Just click the link in the description below to learn more, and I hope you join me there. All right, so let's turn over to the desktop, and here I've got the 3 photos from the in the field video we were just looking at, and let's just walk through them really quickly. So like I showed you on the preview, this is the first of the 3, so this is the foreground, nice and sharp, but you can see how it's getting out of focus just even over here to this branch, and then to the rock behind it. If we go over one image, now this branch is in focus, but the rock in the background and the branch in the foreground, they're out of focus. And then finally, as you would have imagined, the third photo, we've got the rock that's in focus, but the 2 branches in the middle ground and the foreground are out of focus. And so now we need to actually stack them together. If we want to have one photo with everything from the foreground to the middle ground to the background in focus, that's called focus stacking, and we're prepared to do that. But before we go into Photoshop, I just want to show you something. So let's go into the develop module here. So what I like to do, actually we'll go first to this first photo.
all I did, just to, in full disclosure, this is the original image straight out of camera. And I don't do anything in terms of adding any sharpening or cropping the photo. Definitely don't crop. Don't do anything like that. Just kind of keep it as original as possible. But I did want to kind of get to a place where it looks decent. So all I did was get a custom white balance, and I just adjusted the basic panel here. So like the exposure and the highlights, shadows, and white and black point. And then what I did was I took this first photo they edited. I shift clicked and selected the other two photos, and then I went to sync settings. And as you can see, I hit check none because by default, most of these will be checked. I clicked check none, and then I selected white balance and then the basic tone tools because that's what I adjusted here. And then I clicked synchronize, and that basically makes a like edit to the remaining two images so they're exactly the same. And you can see if I go through, as far as tone, they're great. But there's an interesting thing here that you can see as I step through. Remember, I said that my camera is locked down. It was on the ball head and the tripod was locked down. It wasn't moving. But when you see, as I go through the images, you see how as the focus point changes, I mean, your lens is actually moving. Like the barrel of the lens is moving in and out. That's the only way that you can change focus through your photo, through the composition, is by moving the glass elements in your lens. And so that actually does adjust the composition. Now, fortunately, Photoshop handles that really easily. So let's do that. Let's go ahead. We'll go to the grid view, and this is how we do a focus stack. We select all of the photos, and if you have just 2 photos in your bracket set, that's fine. If you have 5, you'll select all of them. And here's the key. You're going to right click, you're going to go to edit in, and then you're going to go to open as layers in Photoshop. And this is a wonderful little shortcut because instead of sending all 3 photos to Photoshop and putting them on their own documents, then having to merge or copy those layers over, this does that all for you. It creates one single document in Photoshop, and it takes all of the photos you have highlighted and conveniently places them on their own layers. I love it. It's great. And so I'm going to go ahead and click that. And so you can see what Photoshop's doing is that it's opening those raw files and placing them onto their own layers. Super convenient. And so now you can see here are 3 photos. If I disable the top layers, you'll see how they came in. So this bottom layer is actually the background. So let's put that on the top. Let's hide them. This one here, that's the foreground. So let's put that in the bottom. And then as you can guess, this is the middle ground. And I like to rename the layers just so that I know. So we'll just call this foreground. We'll call this one middle. And then we'll call this one background. Cool. So now we have our layers. If again, we can turn them on and off, we're good to go. Now we're ready to start getting the focus stack going. So to do that, let's select all of the layers in Photoshop. We'll go to edit, and then we're going to go to auto align layers. This is step number 1. We'll go ahead and just make sure auto is selected, and we'll click OK. Now here's the key. You remember in Lightroom, I was just showing you as we stair step through the photos how it actually looked like it was kind of zooming in. Your composition was changing. That's right here. With the auto align, what Photoshop does is it automatically kind of crops and moves the composition. So if we turn these off, that's how much of your composition you lose just by focusing. Nothing else. We didn't move the camera, but because we were focusing from the foreground through to the background, that's the composition that you lose just by virtue of the fact that the lens elements are moving to get focus. So that's fine. That's exactly what auto align does with the layers, is that it adjusts the composition accordingly. For me personally, I'm okay with this. I'm actually going to go ahead and press C for crop, and I'm going to make sure that I'm set to the original ratio, and I'm just going to crop in and get it so that we just kind of get rid of that extraneous information. But I'm also going to deselect this option that says delete crop pixels. So we're done here. And now that crops the composition for all the layers, so you don't have to worry about it. And as we kind of turn the layers on and off, you can see that the composition isn't moving. So that's good. Now that we have aligned the layers, we can start blending them. We can focus stack them. And so this is the automated way that I was mentioning in Photoshop. To do that, again, make sure your layers, all of them are selected. And then just like before, we'll go to edit and we're going to go to auto blend layers. We're going to make sure that stack images is selected. And then I also have both of these check boxes selected for seamless tone and colors, and then content aware fill. Let's click OK to get that going. All right, so at first glance, you're like, oh, cool. Like, yeah, it's in focus here. I can see this is in focus, the rock's in focus. And Photoshop even did, a nice thing, and it merged all of those layers into a new layer. Very convenient. You can see the masks for each of the focus stacked layers, but here's the problem. Here's why, auto is not always perfect, and why it's on you to analyze the photo before you commit it and send it back to Lightroom. Check this out. Let's go ahead. Let's zoom in a bit. And, we're all thinking like, super, this is great. But you see like right over here, for example, this weird kind of artifacting. It's like a smushing or blurring of the outline of this branch. And it goes through the entire way. And that's due to several reasons. It's also due to the auto align process. It's due to the stacking process. But in all, it's just not in my opinion, this is not a functional photo. I wouldn't want to share this, even though no one would probably really notice unless I called it out. There could be other artifacting, over here, there's a little bit of them. And all you have to do is really just kind of look at some of the mask area to kind of get an idea of where there can be some culprits. So if you're cool with this, good, save it, go back to Lightroom and have fun with it. But let me show you how to do focus stacking in a more manual way where you won't have any of these artifacts, these weird situations. To do that, let's go to history. We're going to go all the way back to just before we started doing the actual align or the blending of the layers. So we'll go right here after the crop there, and we'll go back to layers. You can see that those stacked layers are gone, and then the merged layer is gone as well. So this is how I like to work with the photos. I like to go from the foreground all the way through the background. So the first thing we'll do is we'll turn that top layer off. So we only have the middle and the foreground. And again, this is pretty straightforward, but it is effective. It works great, especially if you have kind of a clean kind of foreground, middle ground, background. Remember in the field, I mentioned that with focus stacking, you really want to avoid having an overly busy scene because that'll make it very difficult. Here, this is nice and clean in terms of I have a clear delineation between the three sections of the photo. So what we're going to do is we're going to select the middle ground layer. And normally, if you just clicked on a new layer mask, it would create it. But I want to create one that's already filled with black, essentially the inverse of a layer mask. So I'm going to press and hold the Option key on the Mac or the Alt key on a PC while clicking on the layer mask, and that creates a black layer mask. And so now you can see that essentially this middle layer is hidden. So I'm going to go to the brush, or you can press B, and then I'm going to make sure that white is my foreground color. Make a nice big brush, and I'm just going to draw. And you can see as I draw, you see how kind of that branch is coming into focus? It's really great. And I'm going to go ahead and draw the entire top of the photo from the middle ground layer through to the top. And you can kind of, again, look at what I'm looking for is that basically I like this soft edge and I want everything above it to be white. So it's revealing that layer. If you want, you can also zoom in and just look to make sure if you did accidentally, like for instance, paint in a blurry section of that, just change your foreground color from white to black by pressing X. And there, you see, I'm just kind of fixing that a little bit there. All right, cool. So that's looking good there. I'm going to go ahead now and, as you can imagine, do the same thing with the background layer. So now I'm going to go and turn that background layer on, make sure it's selected. We're going to press and hold the Option or Alt key to create an inverted layer mask. And then again, let's take our brush. Let's make a nice big brush size. And we'll go ahead and press, make sure that white is the foreground, pressing the X key to change your foreground background color. And just like before, let's go ahead and see, isn't that cool? Like it just snaps into focus. Now I'm just being careful here I don't want to draw on this because as you can see, that just brings it out of focus again. So you just want to make sure that your selection is good, that you're not drawing on or mixing layers too much. It's okay to kind of feather. Now, fortunately, because the water was moving so much, it's kind of a busy pattern as it is. So it works out well, actually. It blends very, very nicely. And again, you can see I kind of started bringing some of that soft focus on that edge there, so we can zoom in and change the foreground color to black, make a small brush, and just bring that detail back. And you can see now we have nice kind of sharpness. We have detail in the foreground. We have detail in the middle ground. We have detail in the background. We've essentially focus stacked. Now, I will say that Photoshop's auto stacking feature works really well most of the times, but it's important to know what to do if it doesn't work, especially if it's important that you have this photo sharp from foreground to background. And if the auto doesn't work, then it's on you to go ahead and figure out how to fix that. Again, layer masks are your friends. Just be sure to look at what's in focus and what's out of focus in between layers, and you'll be all set. And that's how I do focus stacking with my landscape images. I hope it gave you some ideas of what to do next time you're out with your camera. And to continue your video watching journey, just click right here. That's the video I referenced earlier about how to set your back button autofocus, which is invaluable to me. And once again, if you're interested in improving your waterfall photography, I hope you join me in the virtual waterfall photography workshop. I'll see you next time.